Hello and welcome to Deadline. I'm your host, Kerry Campbell, setting in for Wayne Madsen. Today's exciting topics: the U.S. economy. Rail, train, solar, and renewable energy businesses grow. The stock market is up. Wall Street impacts the election primaries with millions in donations. And the U.S. elections. The Green Party's medical doctor Jill Stein, running for the Greens' presidential nomination, may be just what the doctor ordered. The Arab awakening. Demonstrations over a cartoon movie in Tunisia. Trouble in Libya. The central government difficulty maintaining order. Doctors refuse to treat patients to send them back to torture. In Egypt, the new parliament gets to work, and violence at a soccer match. Our guest today, Elizabeth Rose. Elizabeth Rose is a communications director for the Institute for America's Futures. One of her areas of interest: renewable energy, solar, wind, geothermal. William C. Jones. William C. Jones is the bureau chief of the Executive Intelligence Review. And Sam J. Albert. Sam J. Alberts is an attorney. He specializes in bankruptcy, foreclosure, restructuring, and insolvency. All right, let's move to first the economy. In Europe, in the United States, Warren Buffett, with his billions, Warren Buffett bought a railroad last year. And business is so good since he bought it, and profits going so well, he's investing still more money. When he bought it just a year ago, exactly a year ago in February, he said he was all in. And now with Berkshire Hathaway, as usual, they're making money. Renewable energy in the United States now accounting for 14% of our energy, up, creating jobs. The second leading employer in Germany right now. And the euro appears to have stabilized and gone up. First, Liz, let's start with you. What's your take on the economy here in the States right now?
Well, it's interesting. My perception of the economy here in the States is we are on a precipice. We are slowly climbing out of the recession, not quite out yet. There's millions of Americans who don't have jobs, who want jobs, and wages have been stagnating. They haven't gone up in a long, long time. I think it's a delicate time for the American economy. We need to stay focused on getting back a manufacturing base, starting to make things again, and making sure that Americans have jobs. So I think that's really got to be the focus. I want to comment for a second on Warren Buffett. Warren Buffett is an icon of American business. He invests in companies. He makes the companies, he's got quite an eye for making sure that companies are successful. But in America, he's actually become sort of an icon of being the good rich guy, right? So he has come out and said, tax me more. Tax wealthy people like me. I want the government to take higher taxes. And one of the things he pointed out is that because of the American tax structure, where the tax money comes out of your income as opposed to out of investments, super wealthy people like Warren Buffett, like Republican candidate Mitt Romney, pay a lower percentage of taxes than lower and middle income people. So, for example, when President Obama did his State of the Union address the other day, he had Warren Buffett's secretary right there next to his wife to show that we really need to change the tax structure in the United States to become more fair. So I think Warren Buffett is, while his investments are interesting, his limited political activity is also quite interesting.
Well, the public opinion polls, Liz, seem to support exactly what you're saying, that, 75 percentile proposes this idea that Obama proposed in the State of the Union, that millionaires would at least pay taxes at a 30% rate. Bill, I'm going to come to you now. Bill Jones, one of my favorite names, and you're not the famous American singer, Bill.
No, I'm not. I know.
Your take on the economy.
I think there's an illusion to think that it's on the way up. We still have a situation where the amount of outstanding debt is just so great compared to our ability to produce our gross national product, if you want to say. We can never pay that back. None of it has been written off. In fact, most of the debt that was accumulated in the casino economy has been paid off by the U.S. government in the bailout up to, some people say, $70 trillion all in all, TARP money plus the low interest rates. Money is going out to the investment banks, and it has bankrupted the U.S. government. Now, who's going to pay for that? Well, I think grandma's going to wait for less of a Social Security check. They're going to do all kinds of reforms to squeeze it out of the real economy. And I think there's another shoe that's going to drop. And that other shoe is in Europe, but it isn't a European phenomenon only. A lot of the U.S. companies have a lot of interest in terms of over-the-counter derivatives and others which are connected to the European economy. And if Europe doesn't get its act together, which I think it's going to have a hard time doing, and one of these countries goes belly up, we're going to be in the soup one more time. So I'm more pessimistic than Liz over the situation. I would hope it was good. I'm glad that Warren Buffett is investing in railroads rather than in gambling casinos or something like that, because that's at least something real. But there's very little of that happening, and that financial structure, that bloated financial structure, is still weighing down on the real economy. And unless we can do something about it, write-offs, Glass-Steagall, sending it back to the investment banks, something like that has to happen if we're going to get out of this mess. And right now, I just don't see any action, neither in Congress nor from the president on that.
So, Bill, do I understand you to say that there has to be an incentive from the federal government to invest in infrastructure, for example?
Well, the federal government plays a role, but it's not bailing out the bankrupt companies. Their role is to the common welfare of the people. They could, take the example of Roosevelt during the 1930s. He put the screws on Wall Street, but he defended the people. He created jobs for them. He also brought in this Glass-Steagall, which was an iron separation between your commercial banks, where grandma has her savings and you have your income, and the investment banks, which is a gambling casino. When that was gone, these guys came in and they took all that money and they put it into these derivatives, and when it all went belly up, everybody was threatened. That has to be brought back. That, in fact, is something. I know John McCain was one of the sponsors of it in the Senate, and he said to me, he says, the worst thing we ever did was to revoke that Glass-Steagall. But there has been no action because the White House says, no, we can't endanger these Wall Street characters. We're going into an election campaign. So we're still in a big mess.
Sam Alberts, an attorney, like my wife, an attorney, an expert in these areas that, my goodness, since 2008, the bankruptcy, the foreclosure, the drama. From your perspective as a professional working on the street in this economy every day,
right.
Is the trend up? And if it's not up, what have we got to do to move it up?
Well, let me separate the issue of the economy from somewhat of what I do. They are obviously related. But with respect to the economy, what we're seeing still, I would take a slightly different view. I'm guardedly optimistic about the U.S. economy. I think that if you look back to 2007, about 25% of our economy was based on the financial services industry. That was up from about 15%. So you had this enormous increase in shift in where Americans worked. And there was a lot of wealth being created. Now, people may say it was paper wealth. If you think about it, wealth really is paper wealth. What is intrinsic value? But you had this big increase, and a lot of people felt very wealthy. And as a country, we basically got in over our heads. And we are still over our heads financially. You see that there are markets, there are homeowners who are deeply underwater. There are communities that still have felt the effects of when that bubble started to deflate. Now, the interesting thing is, I think while I understand the concern that people had and a lot of criticism for the bailout of the banks, and there was a lot of bad behavior that went on, if we didn't do that, I think most people agree that the situation we would have had would have been a calamity. And as a result of that, what we have is a situation where we are trying to deleverage, sort of figure out what we're going to do next. And the wonderful thing about the U.S. economy is that it's very flexible in that regard. The Europeans, in contrast, I think, because of how things were invested there in terms of sovereign debt, they are facing a much bigger problem. And I don't think it's as easy for them to deal with it, and they really haven't gotten their hands around it. And so while I say I'm guardedly optimistic, a lot of it depends on what happens in Europe. Obviously, if our economies are so interrelated, our banking systems are interrelated, what happens there it has an immediate and profound effect. So we have to be very careful about the situation. Now, in terms of what I do, ironically, for the last few years, most bankruptcy lawyers have been slower than usual. And the reason for that is there isn't a lot of capital to come in and restructure. So what you've had is a situation where a lot of companies have gone over the edge, and you have some people going in and buying them or buying pieces of them and dealing with that. But there hasn't been a lot of restructuring. So you've had things falling off a cliff and then being bought out, which was sort of the traditional model of how bankruptcies happened in a boom-bust cycle rather than restructurings. But things are now changing, and there is more money being introduced into that system, and you're actually seeing more restructurings going on along with distressed acquisition.
Sam Alberts, that's a perfect segue. We've got some folks who were interviewed out on the street reflecting exactly the comments that you had, Sam, and you can fix your earplug, and we'll go to that right now.
No, I don't think so. It's not that their actions don't have influence, but I think if you look, the percentage of people that are involved in that is just so small. It's such a small fraction of the population. I just don't see where it can have any significant impact.
No, not really. I think they're going around about what they're doing the wrong way. While I don't like the Tea Party whatsoever, I think they should take a lesson from the Tea Party and organize politically rather than camping in parks and marching down the streets.
I don't think it has had an influence on the U.S. economy. It makes great news, but it's a small number of people, and that really, the U.S. economy is just huge.
On the economy, no. I think it's had an influence on the political discourse, but I don't think it's helped. I don't think it's had much effect on the economy itself, no.
Fascinating, of course, did Occupy have an effect? The Occupy movements all across the country have an effect on the economy. Would you say that they've certainly changed the debate by now bringing new terms to the spectrum of the 99% versus the 1%, Liz?
Yeah, I think the Occupy movement has had a huge impact in terms of the debate, and particularly in terms of focusing on, the 99% of Americans who are not wealthy. And I work for a group that's tried to get focus on inequality issues for years, honestly, to little success. If you analyze the major newspapers over here, the Occupy movement definitely changed the debate. They haven't yet changed the economy, but if the combination of the Occupy movement and President Obama's proposals, for example, to change the tax rates for wealthy people, then that could make a huge impact. So I think they are really valuable. I understand some of the criticism of their tactics. They haven't been that focused, but I do think that they've been a valuable and exciting movement here in the U.S.
Well, you always have the fringe element, whether Europe or the United States, of the small fraction of anarchists, but Occupy has emphasized nonviolence and that change. And the same Occupy tactics we saw just last night in Indianapolis, Indiana, where the Super Bowl's coming up, where he didn't run on it, but the governor there from George W. Bush's party, Mel Daniels, signed legislation last night for the first time in 10 years, a state going right to work. That means taking away the rights of firemen, teachers, nurses, and you see the unions using, and others using the Occupy techniques to occupy the Super Bowl area. What are your thoughts on Occupy economy, Bill?
Well, I think it kind of lost its momentum to some extent. I mean, there was a tremendous possibility there. I always make the comparison that there wasn't a whole lot of difference. There was a difference in, I would say, their ideas of things, but it was an expression of the same concern that existed in the general population as the Tea Party. That these were a reaction to politics that was going on as people knew it, and they wanted a radical change. But the Occupy movement, unfortunately, if they had had a clear direction and if they had had a political representative, if somebody from Congress would have gone out and say, yes, this is what we have to do, even challenging Barack Obama. I mean, the ironic thing about the Occupy movement is that they were protesting a situation that had been created essentially under the Obama administration, but now they're all focused into getting him reelected president. And in that sense, they've lost their momentum. I think the discontent is still there. People are very upset about the situation, but I think so many issues have been brought into this Occupy movement. It's not a direction on certain specific things we want to change. We want Glass-Steagall, or we want something new coming up. They have all the side issues that they wanted have been brought into this thing, and it just became a big circus, unfortunately. I think it won't go away. I think the discontent's going to be there because, unlike my colleagues here, I think that economic crisis is going to get much worse, and you're going to have a lot more people out on the streets. But if you have people on the streets without direction, without political leadership, it can become very chaotic. So,
well, Bill, wouldn't you? It seems to me, and I've got to go to Sam here just quickly, but that Jill Stein is providing leadership, the Green Party presidential candidate. She's gone to many occupiers all across the country. So there are people vying for that leadership role out there, and other Greens running for Congress and things like that, seeking that leadership that you described.
Well, it's kind of like the Republicans did with the Tea Party movement, that they wanted to impose their policy on this group and push them in that direction rather than.
Well, I think it's a little different. Jill
Take
specifically says to support them, her, not them supporting her. But let me go to Sam. Sam, your thoughts?
My thought is that it definitely has had a impact on the debate in the country. I think people are looking at the issue of equality or inequality much more, and you're already seeing it on both sides. I mean, it's not only an issue that President Obama has embraced, but it's an issue that has come up in the Republican debates. Even yesterday, the front runner in on the Republican side, Mitt Romney, made a statement which was basically he said, I'm not concerned about the poor. And then he went on to say, there's a safety net to help them out. I'm not concerned about the rich. I'm concerned about the middle.
Sam, what about the Democrats? Has Occupy changed it? We've seen where it's changed the debate among Greens and the Republicans, which you just cited. What about the Democrats?
Well, I think that there has been a change. I think that President Obama has glommed on to the message, and he has used that as a foil or a hammer against what he has targeted as the Republicans in Congress not doing things, basically turning the argument or attempting to turn the argument from policies that didn't work that he's put in place. And I might take some issue with that. I actually think that for the most part, things that occurred that were put in place have worked pretty well given the circumstances. But I do think that he has jumped onto this debate and has used inequality as an issue. I think you're going to see more of that, especially as we get into issues of entitlement reform, tax reform, this whole
military spending cuts, perhaps. Even, huh?
Well, that's right. I mean, you
Sam,
really,
we've got to go right now to hear what our folks on the street are saying about this.
Well, we're getting out of a recession, not quickly enough, but we're coming out of it.
It's slow growth. It's personal, obviously. If you're in an industry like housing where nothing's happening, you feel like it's a recession. But if you're in the banking industry, gosh, they've recovered. They're already making a profit.
We have a stubbornly high unemployment rate of at least 8.5%. That's the official rate. Of course, the unofficial rate is clearly much higher than that. And you know what? For that 8.5% of people, this is a recession.
Yes, it takes time to come up out of this downturn that we're experiencing at this moment. It seems like in the past, every 8 to 10 years, there's been somewhat of a downturn. However, unfortunately, it seems to be that, and I probably shouldn't make this comment, but I'm going to, when the Republicans are in office, we always end up in a downturn. Yes.
Well, a totally nonpartisan comment there. Sam, some folks think we're still in a recession going down. Your opinion is that we are not. Is that true?
Well, I think as a technical term, we are out of a recession right now. The question is, though, are people still hurting, and are they hurting more than they had been before the downturn in 2007? And I think the answer is yes. There's still a lot of people that are suffering. You know, we live a bit in a bubble in Washington, D.C. It is an incredibly wealthy area to live in. Not everybody is wealthy here, but you don't see the level of grinding poverty on a day-to-day basis unless you really go out and look for it in D.C. And there are areas in this country, not too far outside of Washington, D.C., where people have been hurt economically in a significant way, and things have not come back. And I think the real long-term question, and this is something that I think Liz has a pretty good grip on, is, you know, how do we shift our economy or go into areas such as manufacturing where there will be good jobs for people going forward? And I think that is a big issue, and I think that's the cloud that's lurking out there. And when I say I'm guardedly optimistic, that's the reason why I'm not enthusiastic, because I think there are these very important issues out there, and we haven't figured it out.
Liz, are you optimistic?
I actually am optimistic. I am concerned about the European economy and that's impact on the United States. But I am just generally an optimistic person. And I actually, I think we are slowly climbing out. But I think you're right. The key issue is America needs to be able to make things. We need to change the policies so that American companies make things over here. You know, not that we want to become too protectionist, but that we have to stop shipping all the jobs overseas. We have a lot of innovation over here. And I think there's been this kind of mentality in American business where they shop for cheap labor. And we really need to stop that, you know.
Which policy, in addition to that, do we need to change?
Well, I think that one of the things that needs to change is focusing on teaching our kids work readiness skills, make sure they have their math skills up, make sure there's enough investment in education so that teachers are paid decently, so that when we send our kids to public schools, it's a great equalizer. Used to be in this country, anybody could be anything, right? Barack Obama was born a poor kid, and he's now the president of the United States. And I think that we want to become that country again, where the public school system is a great equalizer. Kids educated in the United States can get the best jobs around the world.
I think we can agree on that we have to have an emphasis toward manufacturing. The big mistake was the outsourcing that went on because of the strength of the U.S. dollar. We could buy it cheaply initially in Mexico and the maquiladoras, and now also more and more in Asia. You don't want to stop international trade, but you don't want to destroy your own industry at the cost of that. You want to, in fact, the U.S. at the wage levels that we have here compared to China or to Vietnam or one of these countries means we have a higher quality of labor power. We can put those guys to work in the kind of jobs that the Chinese worker and the Vietnamese workers can't do because they have such low wages. But the problem again remains that if we had a financial system that was geared toward manufacturing, we could do that. But we have this outstanding debt which is there sucking up all the free energy that could go into reviving Detroit. I mean, maybe we won't produce cars. We could produce pressure vessels for nuclear power plants that China could buy. They can't produce those things themselves. But that's the orientation we have to have. But you got to tackle this financial issue. You can't just let it stay there and think it's going to go away because it's just too big.
Bill, it's excellent, and thanks for mentioning that. We see just this week an old Green Party leader, Danny Cohn-Bendit, has led the charge in France for the transaction tax, as Ralph Nader here over a decade ago called for taxing these financial transactions and using that as a method to shift resources from the finance sector, the paper sector, as you were referring to it earlier, Sam, and back into the infrastructure. And Jill Stein talks about it specifically, the infrastructure in the Green New Deal she's advocating. Sarkozy, of course, yesterday said he would, in the French Parliament, enact autonomously, France alone of the European nations, a transaction tax. Any chance of us doing that here?
This is becoming a debate. This is the reflection of what is Glass-Steagall here is reflected in some of these things going on in France. And I know the French situation. One of my colleagues, Jacques Chaminade, has just gotten the 500 mayors to support his candidacy for the presidency, and that kind of shocked the whole political elites in France. But that's the issue, and it's being discussed. It's being discussed by Francois Hollande, who is the Socialist Party candidate, of putting up this firewall, that is restricting the investment banks to their gambling casinos, but keeping them away from the money that can fund, that's the savings of people, but also can fund the physical economy. And Sarkozy may be showing this, but he's a very clever guy, and he's not in a very good position now. So you're going to see
20% approval rating.
You're going to see him moving from one issue to another in ways that you haven't seen before, because he wants to secure his position, as is Barack Obama. Now, Barack Obama, he talks a good talk, but boy, he doesn't really walk the walk. And now he's saying something different. Yeah. Do you think if he's reelected, he's going to do something different? I really am skeptical about that. And, I say that sadly because I think the Democratic Party is a very important player in this thing, but they have been more or less top-down control. Glass-Steagall was off the table. And with Barack Obama calling the shots, I think it's unfortunate. I wish somebody would have challenged him. That would have created some kind of an interesting campaign, I think. But nobody's going to do it because they just made a decision. Nobody's going to be opposed to the president. We're going to get him reelected.
Sam, will this new energy that we see in America on the street with Occupy Wall Street or Occupy All Over, and with the proposals that Liz has talked about and Bill has talked about, will that have an impact on our election? Is it having an impact, for example, on the Republican primary right now, or the message and I think we've alluded to this earlier, the message that the president is pitching?
Yeah, I do. I think that it is not a transplant of the message. I don't think he's adopted out of whole cloth, and I don't even think he would state that the inspiration for it is the Occupy movement, because I think, sadly for the Occupy movement, they've marginalized themselves, not so much with their message, but maybe more just their camping out. And, it brings back, a vision in a lot of Americans' minds of the late 1960s and kind of a silly behavior in their mind. And I do think that they've lost their message through their actions. With that said, though, I do think that there is a lot of angst out there. There is a great deal of anxiety. I think most Americans recognize fundamentally that we do have a debt problem as a country. Yeah. We have a situation where they are worried that are the best years of America behind them. I'm an optimist too. I believe that the great thing about America is we reinvent ourselves, and we find a way of doing that. And if you really look at it from a Republican standpoint, they would say that's exactly sort of our message. Nobody can predict this. You let the market do it. You let forces in the environment take over and run this. So we should allow that to happen. I think fundamentally, if you can get around the rhetoric, that is the big distinction between the parties right now. I think Obama has pretty much captured the center in his message. I think the Republicans have taken, at least in the primary season, a much more of a orthodox view on how the economy should be stimulated. And I think it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. There's anger on both sides. I mean, that's why you had the Tea Party movement on the right, and you have the Occupy movement on the left, and then you have this sort of passive middle, but is the middle getting more restless? And I think that's what we're going to have to wait and see.
Excellent. Well, we've got some more comments from our folks on the street out here, so we're going to go and see what they said about this now.
I do think they have an influence on the discussion and the dialogue, and probably an influence on who eventually is the Republican nominee.
Not really. If you look at the pre-election campaigning that's going on, the primaries and so forth, you don't see it coming up as a subject that's being debated or bantied about or whatever.
I'm not sure. And I really can't comment on it. I'm not sure. I had an opportunity to walked by McPherson Square the other day, and I really can't get a gauge on the impact at this point from what I've seen. I know that the people in the area have heard and have seen, the action, and they hear the comments from everyone. But as far as the actual impact, I really don't know.
Liz, is the United States ready with some 55% of folks identifying themselves as independents, only in the 20s, low 20s, high 20s, the two larger parties, people self-identifying as members of those parties? Is the United States ready for Jill Stein's Green Party or another third party?
I mean, I don't think right now the United States is ready, but I think that momentum is building for alternatives. I mean, Bill talked about there's a lot of, on the progressive side, some discontent with President Obama. And I think, but generally people are not going to hit him from the left because the choices in November, are going to be probably Mitt Romney and Barack Obama. So Barack Obama is a much better choice for most of the center and most of the left, and I believe he's going to win re-election. At the same time, the real problem in America that trickles down to everything is money in politics. So why won't there be a transaction tax? Because of money in politics. Right. Because the people who can afford it are going to make sure there isn't a transaction tax. Even if it polls at 97%, 97% of Americans want it, and I don't know, I'm making up that number. Because of money in politics. You can buy, yesterday there was a primary in Florida, and Mitt Romney bought a bunch of ads, changed public opinion, and won that primary.
$12 million or something.
Yeah, I mean, and so I think eventually the pressure on money in politics, if the Citizens United ridiculous decision, Citizens United that allows corporations to give as much as they want and wealthy people to give as much as they want. I mean, the American political system, which is still a democracy, is really becoming more and more corrupt. I think that will lead to probably something, but it's going to be a while off.
So Bill, is the system corrupted?
Well, it's corrupted, but most of your politicians, most of the Congress are pure cowards. They could get
what was
the
that
support.
Word?
Cowards, cowards. In fact, some of them even admit it. When you go with sensitive issues, say, "Hey, I agree with you, but I can't play that game up here. I'll never get reelected. I'm a coward."
She made the other point. The Libertarians look like they're going to have a two-term governor on their ballot in all 50 states. Johnson from Arizona, a fairly successful fellow. There's always a possibility that Ron Paul, one of the final four Republicans still standing, and who has been, along with Jill Stein, the most aggressive for cutting spending, fiscal hawks, to military spending overseas and calling for bringing back. Their obstacle, as Liz pointed out, to get in the game is Wall Street money. I heard Dan Rather, you guys all remember Dan Rather, used to anchor the CBS News, on Rachel Maddow the other night, and he said, with Citizens United, the potential positive here is that if somebody can get a hold of $500 million, they immediately become a credible candidate, whether that's Johnson of the Libertarians, Stein of the Greens, or Ron Paul on his own.
Well, if you look at Ron Paul, I don't think he had, of course, he's got money going. He's got a machine, though. He has built up a political machine, and he's got a lot of support. He's certainly not going to be the nominee. But if Romney is the nominee, as we see in, I think, the Washington Post today, I think is accurate, Ron Paul is going to play something of a role, because Romney realizes that he's got a base there that can be very important. I think Barack Obama is going to have a tough time getting reelected. I'm not prepared to give him a pass, and I think a lot of people throughout the country really feel that they don't trust his words anymore, as beautiful as he can speak or sing, as we learned just the other day. It's not the substance. The substance is what he has done, and so that. Not that people are not going to vote for him, they're just not going out and work for him. So he's going to have a tough time.
Even against a multimillionaire Romney who has done, who said he doesn't care about the
I
very
think
poor.
he can do it.
He made a $10,000 bet.
Yeah, always makes these bloopers. But, he's kind of a likable guy. He tries to be friendly. He's not a lunatic like King Rich and going out and alienating people. And I think people are upset. They just want a change. That may not affect the congressional elections at all, but the presidential elections, the personality and the trust in Barack Obama is going to be an important issue. And I think that trust is low. I think you can have a change in America, and I think if people in Congress did not think so much about the money that they had to get reelected, they could put through the legislation. An example like Glass-Steagall. Again, McCain said to me, I think Glass-Steagall would pass the House, but it didn't come up in the House because the White House says, no, this is too controversial. So they didn't take it up. But I think if they had...
The Republicans in the House wouldn't let it come up because they're Republicans.
Nobody... Yes, there was Republican support for that.
But not the leadership.
Walter
John
Jones,
Boehner's not going to let...
But you would have gotten this taken up, and I think they would have gotten support from the general public. They understand these issues. They're not friendly to Wall Street. They know what the game is all about. And they would have gotten that support, and therefore everybody who pushed it would get reelected because it would be a very popular item. That's what politics is all about. And these guys keep looking at the money, or they get scared because the power is breathing down their necks. This is really unfortunate. And I think the only way you can change it is by getting people out on the streets with a program to light a fire on the behinds of these
people
guys.
on the streets. Sam,
Yes.
I want to come to you. I want to first tell and I'm counting on you for a conservative perspective here, Sam.
Okay.
It's a pay-to-play system, to put it in a kind way. Another way to say it, our political system in the United States, you pay for advertising, you get covered, or corrupted by money. I just ran last year as an independent for local office, and we knocked on 40,000 doors, every door in the local county we knocked on. But still, we couldn't get our message out because we didn't have the bucks. And that was a local race in one district, in one county, and the incumbent who was reelected there spent $200,000 for a local office, and most of that came from the usual suspects. So the corruption of our political system, the almost enfeeblement of our political system, what Occupy has addressed. How do we fix that, Sam, or is it okay? It's just the capitalist way.
Well, you've asked for a conservative perspective. I don't know. I wouldn't self-identify as a conservative, but I would. Maybe on this panel, I am. I think there are two schools of thought on it. One school of thought is it is broken. That money is an influence, and people are beholden. If you have to go out and get money to run a campaign, you're going to be beholden to the people that give it to you. That's just, that's how business is done. Why would politics be any different, especially if you want to get reelected? So, there have been different ways to try to deal with it. One is, term limits. I mean, if you don't have to be reelected that many times, you won't be that beholden. You can vote your conscience, so to speak. Another way, that's being discussed is, in light of Citizens United, disclose where the money came from and allow least people to know who it is that's giving you the money so they can make an educated decision about whether or not you are in the pocket of somebody else and whose pocket you're in. Now that assumes that you have a very informed electorate who really will go in and look at this information. And then there's, the other side of it, which is publicly financed elections. Have we reached that point where money is such a huge factor that it is worthwhile to allow public finance? Now, there are issues, concerns about that. I think the biggest concern is that for Americans, it smacks of Europeanism, and if anything looks like it's European, they're going to reject it, almost out of hand. And I think that's a real problem with the American mindset, sadly. How do we deal with this? I mean, I would start slow in light of this. I would start with the disclosure issue. I would start with that as a big source, and then see how that goes. And if it doesn't go, and people are still very upset about it, move into another direction.
One interesting thing about this is that I think it's easy to talk about the problems, but it is really difficult to come up with a solution. From free airtime, I mean, no matter what, money is going to mean power. No matter what we set up, and we've done campaign finance reform before. This is the second or third go-round in my lifetime. And the reality is people with money figure out a way, they get smart lawyers, and they figure out a way around the system. And so, and while I disagree with Citizens United, I think it's completely wrong, I do understand the concept of freedom of speech, right? We want freedom of speech. I certainly wouldn't want people to not be able to get together and hire a representative in Washington. I believe in that. If I'm a teacher, I don't want to spend time lobbying. I want to be able to hire someone to represent my interests. So, I think there's a fine line. It is really easy to focus on the problem, but it is much harder to come up with solutions. And I agree, disclosure is the way to go. It really helps to have transparency. Barack Obama's super PAC just got $1 million from the SEIU, which is a union that represents kind of low-wage workers and, office workers and stuff like that. And, makes me like them more. I don't have a problem with that. But it's nice to know it, right? So, it's also nice to know that they have $1 million to give. It's all information. And then when you see that the Koch brothers, who are these industrialists who basically just want to make money, they want to tear down any regulation, how much money they give on the Republican side, it's important. And I think the disclosure rules it's not open enough.
I think one thing is in times of a political crisis like the present, a lot of things can happen you don't expect to happen where money rules. If you look, for instance, what happened in Wisconsin, it reflected something of what happened in Egypt, that people were out on the street. Who thought Hosni Mubarak, how would he ever be thrown out of power? Same thing happened in Wisconsin with that governor when he passed his anti-union laws, and they were connected, and they sent the Egyptian demonstrators bought pizzas for the occupiers in Wisconsin, fist over two continents. Those things can happen, but they can happen under certain economic conditions where people realize they have got to do more than simply go out and vote.
All right, Bill, I think now we have a comment here from the Green Party presidential candidate seeking the nomination, Jill Stein, talking about Wall Street and U.S. military spending.
Democrats and Republicans alike dismantled protections against waste, fraud, and abuse by Wall Street. This bipartisan cooperation enabled greed to crash the economy. And that not only killed jobs, it also depressed tax revenues, which has been one of the biggest drivers of the federal deficit. And that deficit has also been made worse by unconscionable spending choices, notably the $4 trillion spent on illegal wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, and trillions more being spent on the bloated Pentagon budget, tax giveaways for the wealthy, and bailouts for Wall Street.
That's Jill Stein, medical doctor, housewife, mother, 61 years old. Running for the Green Party nomination for president. Sam, what do you think?
I think that I disagree with some of the things that she said in there. And some of them I think are, they have a rhetorical flair but are not fully accurate. Let's take the military, for example. The wars in Iran and Iraq, rather. There may be Iran in some day, but not currently.
We hope not.
I don't think the country has an appetite for that at the moment. But Iraq and Afghanistan take issue for the reasons why we got into Iraq. I think most Americans, with very few exceptions, would say our presence in Afghanistan, at least when it began, was justified. I think that
a decade ago.
And I think if you listen to what's coming out of Wall Street.
Sam, are you a veteran? Did you serve in the military?
I did not serve in the military.
I am a veteran. I did serve in the military. We're spending almost $880 billion a year on the U.S. military without an auditable accounting system there. That means we can't prepare financial statements. Just the other night, 60 Minutes had a piece about $40 billion with a B, $40 billion. We had heard before about $1 billion going on pallets and disappearing in Iraq, and now it turns out to be 40 billion. Those fiscal hawk issues that Dr. Stein raised, if we're talking about the need for cutting spending, and I suspect that with a deficit of almost $1 trillion this year, 1.5 trillion last year, maybe it's time for that. But go ahead, Sam. I don't want to.
No, I think that, I mean, you raise a good point, and this is one of the issues. I mean, in terms of the military, I think there are issues under review. The accounting system does need to be changed. I think most Americans believe that, but also keep in mind that, you know, our military program is a jobs program to a large extent in terms of not only weaponry, but
Winslow Wheeler wrote a book called Wastrels of Defense.
Yeah.
Wastrels of Defense, where he shows conclusively that it's one of the least effective engines of economic growth by military spending. So that is an old axe that some folks do bring up, that military spending stimulates the economy. I don't think that's an argument that has certainly in my 55 years been convincing. Bill, what are your thoughts?
Well, I think it's probably the only thing that I agree with Jill on, because I think the whole green perspective and is really the neo-Luddites, that is the old machine destroyers from the 18th century that didn't like the notion of scientific progress. Nuclear energy is absolutely necessary. We probably disagree on that. But what she said about the economy was right. I mean, we have to get away from bailing out Wall Street. This was the argument that Geithner was giving to Obama. He swallowed a hook, line, and sinker. We didn't need Wall Street to survive. Wall Street isn't what we base ourselves on. It's our physical economy. There is an intrinsic value here. The intrinsic value is that man survives by producing what he needs for his survival, and by creating new ideas, he can continually expand his population and expand what we call natural resources through the development of his new scientific ideas, right? Once upon a time, iron ore was simply a rock to primitive man. It didn't become iron ore until we developed the technology. This is how man has grown from several 100,000 to almost, what are we now, 6 billion and going on 7 or more. We do that because we can move forward technologically, right? And that's what we have to do. And we've got to get this whole financial bubble out of our face, which is sucking everything up that we need to invest in our technology. So in that sense, I think what she said was correct on many of the other issues we're going to be.
Well, certainly it's a look to the future with the wind energy, the solar energy. This is the future technology.
If you look, for instance, at a place like Africa, which has a very growing population, and I was down there at a space conference last year. South Africa is developing a lot of space technologies. They see this as the center for scientific development. They're not going to be able to support their population with wind and solar. They're going to need a lot of energy if they're going to bring them up to a level of modern standards. Same way with the Chinese. And what are they doing? They're investing in nuclear energy. Now, nuclear energy, we won't have that forever.
Excuse me, Bill. There's a proposal for a massive solar field in the Sahara, which would create a lot of electricity. Liz, let me come to you now.
The only place you can really do the solar right is if you get up close to the sun. But then we need a space program to be able to get up there, because then the density of energy that you get from the sun is so great.
You know, Bill, I would believe that if I didn't have a zero energy house myself with solar on it, and I get a return on my money of 4 to 8%.
How many people live in your house?
My wife and I.
Okay, compared to 6 billion people? How are they going to?
I'm just giving you a personal example of making money and consuming no energy and producing more energy than we consume.
You can do that.
Liz?
I mean, the interesting thing about the tape that we saw, Dr. Stein. I wish that debate was going on in the United States right now. I mean, she is on the left of what's going on.
She calls herself a fiscal hawk.
She does, and I wish more people were talking about what she's talking about. But let me give you an example of what is going on today. So Senator McCain, who's a senator who's also head of the Armed Services Committee in the Senate, came out with 3 of his buddies today and talked about they want more domestic spending cuts. They want to cut the safety net to have more money for defense in the United States. I mean, so that's and now we obviously would oppose that. I think that we all think that defense spending is too high now.
It's nuts.
A great way to improve the deficit is to spend less on defense.
Right.
We're spending like we were in the Cold War.
We've never spent more on defense, on military spending in the United States than now. No one has ever spent more on the U.S. military than Barack Obama.
But my point is, I'm just trying to talk about, sort of the mainstream politics in the United States.
Right.
So Barack Obama is talking about slower growth of the military budget.
That's right.
And the Republicans are talking about doubling. Mitt Romney is running around talking about the double. So while I appreciate her thoughts, sort of the mainstream reality here in America is, we have Senator McCain, who is one of the leaders in the Republican Party, and Mitt Romney talking about doubling the defense budget and cutting the safety net. And then we have Barack Obama saying, let's grow the defense budget more slowly. A lot of people, and I see her point, would actually like bigger change than that. But because of, again, money in politics, I think it's going, it's not very realistic and not in the short term. That doesn't mean people can't work long term on solutions. But I do think, as someone who is a progressive, I too am going to support Barack Obama in part because, there's some important issues that he has done a good job on. Like, I happen to like the 2 Supreme Court justices that he's been able to pick, and they're really important to me. But, it's interesting talking to you about the Green Party because I do think people can work on different levels for change, whether it's the Green Party or Occupy or in the Democratic Party. But it's hard for me to wake up in the morning and not deal with the day-to-day reality.
Well, on the front page of the paper today, Panetta is saying, just like Sarkozy did a couple of days ago, that we need to pull the troops out of Afghanistan a year in 2013 rather than 2014.
And that's great. But I would agree the defense budget cuts are still not big enough. But I do think that part of the reason why, we could debate whether or not it's a jobs program, but in fact, there are a lot of African Americans, Hispanic Americans who are in the military. And I think there's a big lobby who says we do not want them back here looking for jobs when there's already an 8-9%. So, I mean, whether the truth is whether or not it's a jobs program is less of a concern than the people lobbying for the military-industrial complex, which includes people on the left and the right, the steel workers, right? I mean...
Well, everybody, the thing about the military and people involved in it, it touches almost every community in the country, whether you have a base there or you have a manufacturer or you're living in an area where a large proportion of young men usually, but also women, go into the military because they don't have local jobs. I mean, there are reasons why it has the support it has. It's also almost viewed as now that if you are not at least somewhat supportive of the military, it's almost anti-patriotic, and which I don't think is a fair analysis of it. But that is where it has become politically, that you have to at least support the troops, and then the question is, how much do you support the troops? Rather than, look, it's time that we retrench a little bit. Let's bring our troops back from Korea, from West Germany. Let's save that money. I don't think you really have an appetite for that conversation, at least not now. And part of it, and this is going back to, unlike in Syria, for example, where people are literally fighting for their lives.
That's right.
We don't have these problems in the United States. We have, somebody described it as first world problems. Where do I send my kids to school? And what's the rank of the school? Is it in the top 5% or the top 10% in the area? I mean, we don't have the problems that so many people around the world have.
Sam, we've got some comments. We want to get on the street, pick up on what you said about Syria. Is the U.S. either overtly, covertly, incorrectly mixing in there with Syria and making the problems more difficult than we should? We'll go to our comments on the street, and we'll talk about that once we hear what they say.
Well, of course it's had an influence on the U.S. It remains to be seen where things are going to come out in the final solution. Of course, some people treat all Arab or Muslim countries as being one when they're not. You can't compare Saudi Arabia to Iraq. You can't compare Egypt to Yemen. They're all different countries. So, we'll have to see what happens.
I'm sure has had an impact on the American economy, on our public relation, our interaction with their government, our imports and exports. So yes, I do feel that, I don't know what the answers are, but I do feel that any type of obstruction and unsettling activity that's going on in the Middle East at this moment does present challenges for us here in the U.S.
Oh, I think dramatically. It has changed the way that we've sort of been optimistic about the Middle East, in the sense that whether you think it was the right thing or the wrong thing, it's definitely changed the perspective of the United States on the Middle East in terms of how we view the people and how we view the political process.
I think so. Not in terms of the way our government works, but in terms of awareness and going forward, I think it's had an effect.
All right, Liz Rose, your thoughts.
I think it's interesting. I mean, those comments seem to be more about the Arab Spring as a totality than specifically Syria. I think people in the United States are excited about the Arab Spring. They think, democracy's bursting all over. I think there is some concern about what's going on in Syria right now, but there's very little appetite for U.S. involvement. People want to build schools here at home. They are much less interested in building schools someplace else. So I think if there's any action, they don't care if Hillary Clinton goes and our Secretary of State goes and talks to people and works diplomatic, but there's very little appetite for any kind of U.S. involvement.
Let me mention the Syria thing, because I'll answer your question positively. Yes, we are involved in that. And the target there is Iran. The target has nothing really to do with Syria. Obviously, people are very upset, and the Arab Spring is a very extensive discontent. It's not going to be over at all, but we are promoting it in this case to get from Iran a very important ally in the area, to create a new regime. Regime change is the name of the game. Similar to what they did in Libya, although in this case, because of the reaction from the U.S. military, and when the Israelis were threatening to do something about Iran, the top military people went out and said, look, we cannot do this. We cannot be drawn into this. So that they stopped at what could have been a war in the Middle East. But that potential is still there. And the real target is not Iran. It's Russia and China. And that's why Russia and China are really getting together in what is today a strategic relationship. Barack Obama's new Asia pivot that he used scared the heck out of the Chinese. And it also upset the Russians. What is the U.S. doing in this area? What are they going to do to us? And they've expressed their discontent with Putin's attempt to become president. That has created a tremendous amount of tension globally. And if there is a war in the Middle East, I fear that will escalate into a conflict, because Russia and China are not going to be in favor of this, and they're going to see it as an attack. So it's a dangerous situation. We're playing it in a very bad way.
We're almost out of time. Let me give you a few seconds here.
Well, I do think that people in the United States have a mixed feeling about the Arab Spring in general. I think that they are happy to see, and it's been a mixed bag results-wise for the United States in terms of where things look to be positive. Libya, I think, most Americans will say it's a very positive development. I think in terms of Egypt, the jury is still out with respect to the U.S. And our interest there. In terms of Syria, I hope that we're involved in some way. I think that is a very tough
Why should we
regime.
be involved there? I mean, aren't Ron Paul in the Republican Party and Jill Stein in the Green Party right? We need to come home and mind our own business?
Well, we're not there with boots on the ground, and I think that you can make that argument. We shouldn't have boots on the ground. As far as we know, we may have special ops forces there or CIA intelligence there. I'd be surprised if maybe the CIA wasn't there. But in terms of boots on the ground, I don't think you have an appetite for that. But in terms of what is happening in Syria, given the importance of it geopolitically, I think that we do have an interest there. I mean, our interests are global. And that's the thing that I think when we start talking about retrenchment, about bringing troops home, about spending less, the counter to that, or the fear of that, is, well, what happens to our position in the world? What happens to the way we have done business for the last 50 or 60 years?
So you mean our influence, and that is our time. I want to thank you all for an exciting show. Let me also apologize if I interrupted a couple of times, but what you said was so exciting. Elizabeth Ross, thank you so much. Bill Jones and Sam Alberts. It has been a pleasure. Join us again next time for Deadline. I'm Kerry Campbell.